In its modern usage, myth has rather disparaging overtones, something made up, fake news. But in its original meaning, it's a narrative through word of mouth. It's a story, not a story as entertainment, but it has a deeper meaning than that. It carries strong ideas, beliefs. It shapes ideas and influences. Myth expresses a worldview. So when I say that childhood is a myth, what I mean is that it's simply a story that we tell ourselves, but it's a story that has immense power to shape children's lives. It's a story with great consequences. We've all been children, many of us are parents, so we take it for granted that we know what childhood is. I'm not going to waste time trying to define it at the moment. The important point is that we can't establish agreement about the term without acknowledging the social perceptions within which it's experienced. Like other major aspects of social life, gender, beauty, masculinity, motherhood, childhood is socially constructed. It arises from culture. We have to distinguish between biological immaturity, which is a fact of nature, and the social institution of childhood. Immaturity is a biological fact, but the way that immaturity is understood and made meaningful is a fact of culture. If we look at the pictures here, the little lad on the left, we're very used to this image of childhood. All these children, about 18 months, outside in their normal environment. He's strapped in his buggy. He can't really explore. He's kept safe. Quite different to the one in the middle. Take the machete to daddy, darling. But if you're living in the sort of environment he is in Cameroon, you have to be responsible. You have to be able to look after yourself. It's not quite as shocking in other circumstances. And I love the little lad from Kathmandu. Where you don't have nappies, you don't have washing facilities. He may have very elaborate clothing, but no nappies. The way in which we respond to children is a matter of culture. The idea that childhood is socially constructed shouldn't be confused with the idea that children are the product of their social experiences. It's a statement about the category of people we understand as children, not about individuals. So although your childhood is unique to yourself, we all share the experience of a late 20th century childhood in a Western post-industrial economy. And that's quite different to, for instance, Victorian childhood, a Japanese childhood, a refugee childhood. What shapes culture's attitudes and beliefs about children is discourse. They come about through discourses, an accepted view or explanatory framework that isn't a neutral way to describe the world, but carries immense social power. It determines which versions of reality are accepted. Western society view of childhood is shaped by two competing discourses. The discourse of the sinful child constructs the child as wayward, comes from the doctrine of original sin. Augustus of Hippo developed this doctrine. Further, he taught that parents transmitted sin to their children through sex because of the sin of lust, and so children are born wicked. He was a fun guy, Augustus. Children are born sinful. Their natural tendencies must be corrected so that they can grow into civilized adults. It starts at baptism, christenings, still remarkably tenacious habit despite striking decline in religious belief. So good parents don't take their children to the devil. They, with the help of the church, aim at civilising children away from their inherent evil. Physical punishment, as we see on the left, is always a large part of that. A couple of these. Theo Penny, who drew this, was a local artist. He died in Hastings in 1913. But the point of this, the sheer prevalence of these postcards demonstrates the taken for granted notion of physical chastisement of children. It permeates children's culture as well, from Billy Bunter to Beano. Dennis the Menace, it's nicely alliterative, but it's also interesting the amount of negative language around children. Little beasts, little monsters. It reflects the idea of children's savage state. And bringing that savage state into line is not a matter of humour. There's a scarily high number of books and websites, particularly in America, that teach the godly way of bringing your children up. That cute little heart up there comes from the website of Pastor Bruce Edwards, who gives us his advice down at the bottom here. So we can effectively raise godly children. For this, you can buy this belt. My husband's just bought himself a new belt. Very different circumstances. The advertising here makes clear what it's for. It fixes talking back, yelling, not eating, running in stores, wicked sins like that. But if the discourse of the sinful child was purely about physical punishment, corporal punishment, it would be easy to spot. But actually it underpins a lot of the way in which adults think about children, our ideas about children. Swaddling. Wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger. There's many ideas about swaddling. It's not always necessarily a bad thing, but it involves constraint, constriction of the child. And very, very common. The baby Duke of Beano, his swaddling clothes are slightly more decorative, but I don't expect his mother had to worry about the washing. The Chumley sisters in 1600, I love this picture. Don't think it's historical though. The click of a button, you can buy that from Amazon. This idea of constricting, constraining the child. In a similar vein, Truby King, one of the great childcare voices of the 20th century, suggested that little boys in particular put them to sleep with their arms in cardboard tubes. That's immoral. If you've got your arm in a cardboard tube, it prevents your hands from wandering and discovering the bits that pure children don't know about. So there's always this expectation, a strong expectation that children will misbehave. This is from the Instagram site of someone called Frankie Sanford. Never heard of her, but apparently she's a celebrity. She posted this because she bought it for her son for Christmas. The child was born in October. So he's not yet 3 months old. St. Augustine would be proud of you, Frankie. This account of childhood has spawned a whole subgenre of films, the Evil Child movie. Plays on tropes of demonic possession, the fear of evil within an angelic exterior. I've included Lord of the Flies here, though it's not about demonic children. It still taps into fears of children's primitiveness, their natural savage state without adult control. So the fear and concern of childhood is served up as entertainment. It pervades the press as well. Childhood is often seen as a threat to social order. Certain childhoods are more likely to be demonised. If you don't have the nous to arrange to be born into a white middle-class family, then your childhood is more likely to be seen as in negative terms. But the social fear of the young exists alongside a cult of childhood. And the discourse of innocence is much pleasanter to contemplate, though not necessarily any more benign. It suggests that children are inherently innocent, naturally good. It has a powerful association with nature, though it tends to be of the fluffy kitten, pretty flower variety of nature. In the past, it was closely associated with religion because that's what shaped the medieval, early modern mindset. But the same ideas are present in other cultures. For instance, in traditional Chinese philosophy, the Confucianism emphasises discipline and control, whereas the Wang Ming approach is more about awakening the child through self-reflection. But this evening I'm focusing on the Western tradition, where the emphasis began to change a little. We all know the phrase about trailing clouds of glory. In the 18th century, the religious connotations started to change, and the divine nature of childhood. Children are seen as God's creatures, far from being born sinful. They represent original innocence. So representations of children like this are a very common feature in art and literature at this period. Sweet little children on their knees, particularly emblematic of a proper childhood. Less concern about the tussle with the devil. Children need only put their trust in Jesus to be assured of heaven. With the Enlightenment, there were new ways of thinking that affected the cultural imagination. Children began to be perceived as untainted by worldly concerns, worldly cares. Reforms in child labour helped to shape notions of the fleeting vulnerability of childhood. Diana Gitton says, we see in them qualities of innocence, purity, trust, beauty, joy, qualities that we feel that by becoming adults we have lost, like a butterfly. Though this is more natural and relaxed than the previous picture, the whole setup is still totally artificial. What we're seeing here is Gainsborough's feelings about his daughters. He painted a number of pictures of his daughters. There's actually an exhibition opens tomorrow in the National Portrait Gallery of Gainsborough's family portraits. Here's another one. Gainsborough made his living painting portraits, so naturally he had to prioritise paying customers, so he never actually got round to completing this picture. But if you look closely, you can see just outlined there, that fluffy kitten would have been there if he'd finished the picture. Butterflies, fluffy kittens, these images appear all the time. With growing literacy, there's proliferation of children's literature, as opposed to the moralising tracts that children had their sole food before. Alice, Water Babies, Peter Pan, Jungle Book. Remarkable number have now been sanitised by Disneyfication. Childhood is seen as separate from adults, symbolic of that lost Eden, like Mowgli in the jungle. Childhood became the focus of adult nostalgia, conscious that they themselves will never return to the lost Eden. Adults have a huge investment in maintaining childhood innocence. It's why evil child movies are so disturbing, so unsettling. It's that disparity between very unchildlike traits of evil, of sadism, of murder, and childhood as an epitome of innocent purity. There's a great emotional pull associated with smallness and vulnerability, and that rhetoric is exploited by the media. We see it in advertising all the time. But it's also shorthand, because the image carries so much symbolism. Whether your story is war, refugees, natural disasters, a picture of a child will sell the story. Childhood innocence is, of course, a cultural view of natural childhood, the nature of childhood, rather than a judgment of individual children's capabilities and potential. But the slippage between those two concepts means that the association of childhood and innocence has consequences for the actual lived experience of real children. Media portrayals create and reinforce public perceptions, and the image of the child as innocent, weak and vulnerable has tremendous power, as does the alternate discourse of unruly, out-of-control children. And these dual ways of seeing guide our attitudes, our practices and our perceptions of childhood and of children themselves. As a result, children are viewed either as victims in need of protection or threats to social order. I'm not quite sure which one she is. We live in a time of deep anxiety about childhood. Both perspectives are simultaneously evident. They emerge in policy and legislation, in the media, in popular culture, so they have very real effects on children's lives. But children cannot live innocent lives on our behalf. They don't occupy a separate sphere. Unlike Peter Pan and Mowgli, they live among us, and they cannot be better than we are. So when children betray abstract myths of children's proper nature, whose fault is that? Real children are human like we are, and they cannot help but fail to reach impossible standards of what is regarded as a proper childhood. So in conclusion, childhood is a social construction, and so children can be seen as the markers of our humanity. How we view them, how we behave towards them, what our expectations are of childhood says much about who we are as a society.
Fabulous. What another engaging and brilliant talk. So, Rory, just before I throw it open to questions for people, I just wanted to check with you. I have a daughter. Can I use any of those arguments to say that Christmas is cancelled and I don't need to get her anything? Is that legitimate?
Well, if you're prepared to listen to her answers.
Well, thank you. That was a really, really thoroughly engaging talk, and I, for one, as a parent, have learned a lot. Does anybody have any questions for Rory? Does anybody want to ask or learn any more about the myth of childhood? And yes, sorry, I can't see because of the light, so I'll pass it.
I was just interested to know where your research came from and kind of how you got into this topic. And if it's not too personal a question, a reflection on your own experience.
Okay, right. Well, my interest comes from my background as an academic. My area is sociology of childhood, which I taught in the university for many years. I've always been particularly interested in childhood, the way that it changes, the way that it's viewed in different cultures at different times. And for instance, the thing that I picked up particularly from Rachel's talk was I noticed on her poster, it says at the bottom for age 12 to 21. Now, 12, some people would say, oh, you know, that particularly at that time we might have thought that 12-year-olds were, you know, it's a different group. It's not who we think Buddy Holly was playing to. So, you know, those are the things that catch my eye and they, you know, they interest me. So I've always had an obsession about childhood rather than specific children. Doesn't mean I'm not interested in children, obviously, because I have two of my own. My own childhood, interestingly enough, we were having this conversation. I was talking to a friend on Monday, talking about childhood and our parents and how they did the best they could, as all parents do. I was a Truby King child. By the time I was born, he'd been knocked off his perch by Dr. Spock, who changed the whole attitude that children should be. You don't want to be too big, you know, too big for your boots. You don't want to make them feel, you know, sort of too proud. So you keep them down. You don't praise them too much, and so on. You don't cuddle them too much. Dr. Spock came along and reassured mothers that it's okay to cuddle their children. My mother didn't read it. She wasn't cold. I mean, you know, I know that she loved me, but I didn't have the sort of childhood that maybe I wanted to pass on to my children. So I think we all carry habits that we bring along without thinking, and we also stop and reflect on what can I do differently. And all we can do is the best that we can. So go ahead and have Christmas too.
Thank you. Any final questions? Yeah, there's one over there. There you go.
Thanks. Great chat, by the way. From a professional opinion as a child sociologist, what do you think about social media changing the social construct of childhood? And the camera being in their face 24 hours a day, basically. Yes,
I have concerns about that. I wonder if Gainsborough would have been sticking pictures of his daughters up on Facebook if, you know, he'd been alive now. Because children are often treated as chattels. Their pictures are out there without their say. So, you know, I'm not sure. But there's an awful lot of panic as well. Moral panics tend to coalesce around childhood because of the emotional appeal of it, and it's something that adults get very anxious and worried about. A moral panic comes and goes, and when it's gone, you think, what was all that about? Many of you, if you're, you know, Sussex people, will have been around here or will know of the times of the mods and rockers, you know, and mods are down in Hastings and Brighton. I knew somebody who was a mod in Brighton. Family friend wrote in a great panic from Houston. They'd seen it on the news. Was the family all right? At the time, it was a terrible, terrible thing. And we're getting this, you know, we've gone through it with goths, with Pokemon, with, you know, serious, less serious things. Everybody panics about childhood. And there's a big panic about what technology is going to do to children. I think they'll be okay. I think we should trust children, we should trust their competence, we should recognise them as human beings, not human becomings.
Yes, I agree. Okay, there's more questions, but one final question, just because of time, and then...
I was just going to say, do you think that television kills imagination in children, and is it a bad thing?
One of my great heroes, Neil Postman, wrote a book called The Disappearance of Childhood, which argued that television was destroying childhood because it presents the world straight away to children. I mean, for instance, at the time of 9/11, there were little children playing in nurseries, making towers and knocking them down with toy aeroplanes because they saw it on the television. If it's only in the newspaper, then you can't access that. It's a specious argument. I think a lot of Neil Postman, but his argument doesn't hold water. Television is a bad thing for everybody if they just sit and watch it all the time. But I think it tends to be the adults who sit around and watch daytime TV. The children who are put in front of televisions and all screens of all sorts, they can't win. They're either in their bedrooms on screens and we're concerned about that, or they're outside and they're in the way. Because children in public space is a real problem. And we've privatised childhood and we've shut them inside. And then we complain because they need some kind of entertainment. The, sorry, I have to think about it. Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act, 2004, changed the old ASBOs to injunctions to prevent nuisance, IPNAs, injunction to prevent nuisance and annoyance. For an ASBO, you had to prove that somebody was actually causing problems. For an IPNA, they only had to have the potential of being annoying. So a group of kids who have a basketball game once a week could annoy somebody, might annoy the old lady who lives down the road, and therefore you can't have it. So children are actually being swept away. Somebody said that a weed is a flower that grows in the wrong place. Children are always in the wrong place when they're in public. And so if we don't like what they're doing inside, maybe we should think about reviewing our ideas of children in public space.
Thank you very much.
Not a child-friendly society.
Well, thank you very much. Can we thank Rory again for a fabulous talk?